I want to tell you what the cold is, before I tell you anything else. Not because I enjoy it. I have spent most of my working life trying to stay warm, and that effort has cost me more than I care to count. But because if you don't understand the cold, you won't understand any of the rest of it. You'll think it's a story about a child. It is, but it isn't only that. At its root, it is a story about 32 hours in a pod that was never designed to keep two people alive, in a debris field at the edge of the Veth corridor, in weather that had no business being called weather, because weather implies atmosphere. And there was no atmosphere out there. Just deep vacuum and hard radiation, and a temperature that would strip the heat out of anything organic in under an hour if the hull gave way. The cold was the event. Everything else, the child, the cargo token, the cutter that came for us eventually, everything else happened inside the cold. I want you to hold that. My name is Renner Golt. I am 51 years old, though I have been told I look older, and I do not dispute it. I ran cargo on the outer loops for 23 years. Before that, I ran courier routes for the Compact's Border Transit Division, which sounds more official than it was. What it means is that for 6 years, I flew underpowered craft through hostile zones on a fixed salary and expected to be grateful. I was not grateful. I left when my contract allowed it, bought a stake in a converted ore lighter called the Kessian Drift, with 2 other pilots whose names I will leave out of this account because they have families, and this story does not reflect well on the profession. And I spent the next 17 years doing short-hop industrial hauls between processing platforms and the deep field relay stations at the edge of compact jurisdiction. It is not glamorous work. It is not meant to be glamorous. It is the work of moving mass from one location to another, efficiently, without incident, and getting paid a flat rate for doing so. I was good at it. I was, by the end, very good at it. In the specific sense that I had accumulated enough hard-won knowledge of how the outer loops worked. The weather patterns that weren't weather, beacon dead zones, the platform schedules, the bureaucratic exemptions that got your manifest cleared faster. That I could run a route that defeat a less experienced pilot through sheer familiarity. That knowledge saved my life. It also saved hers. Not in the way I would have chosen. There is nothing about what happened out there that I would choose to repeat, but it saved us. The Kessian Drift was destroyed on the 16th of the 9th month. Station calendar. Ambushed is the word the Compact's incident review used, which is a polite word for what actually happened, which is that a pair of unregistered attack craft hit us without warning at the edge of the Veth corridor while we were running a standard ore transfer manifest, and opened us up from the port quarter to the cargo bay in about 11 seconds. I do not know why. I have since been told, by people who claim to know these things, that the corridor was contested at that time, that there were factions operating in the debris field who had reasons to interdict civilian freight, and that the Kessian Drift was in the wrong place on the wrong vector. What I know from direct experience is that I had about 40 seconds between first impact alarm and the moment the bridge became uninhabitable, and I spent those 40 seconds doing exactly what 23 years of outer loop running had trained me to do. I sealed my suit seams, I triggered the emergency pod release, and I got off the ship. The pod was a Type 7 compact escape unit, rated for 1 occupant, 48 hours of atmospheric maintenance at standard temperature. I had personally inspected it at the start of the run, as I did every run because I am not a man who trusts certification dates. The seals were good. Beacon transponder tested live. The power cells read full. I knew this pod. I knew exactly what it could do and what it could not. And as I punched through the debris cloud off the drift's starboard remains, and the shock wave from the secondary explosion hit me and tumbled the for about 15 seconds before the gyros caught it, I ran through the survival calc in my head and decided I had a reasonable chance of making it out of this alive. Contested zone, beacon transmitting, debris field providing some electromagnetic interference but not total blackout. The Compact's corridor patrol running twice daily sweeps. Maybe 8 hours, maybe 12. I had food and water for the rated duration. Had the heat. Then I heard something from the cargo locker. The Type 7 has a small storage bay in the aft section, about a cubic meter of space. Behind a composite panel, rated for emergency supplies, blankets, a medkit, ration packs, a handheld beacon, a signal lamp. I had stocked it myself. I had not stocked it with whatever was making that sound. I want to be precise about what I felt in that moment, because I have since been asked to describe it several times, and I have never found a clean answer. What I felt was not fear, exactly. Fear in the outer loops tends to announce itself clearly and demand an immediate practical response. And I have been afraid many times in my career and have learned to treat it as information rather than sensation. What I felt when I heard the sound from the locker was more like a disruption. The sense that a known quantity had just become unknown, that my careful math was wrong, that the world I had sealed myself into was larger than I had thought, kept the pod running straight while I thought about it. Gyros steady, beacon transmitting, power cells drawing down at rated pace. Then I unstrapped and went aft. The locker panel was not latched. It was held shut by the friction fit of its own composite edge against the frame, which is the default state when you don't latch it. And when I put my hand on it, I could feel the panel flex slightly inward, which meant something on the other side was leaning against it. I opened it. She was folded into the lower shelf, behind the emergency blankets. She had pulled two of them partway over herself, which told me she had been cold for a while before I found her. She was looking up at me with eyes so large and so pale that for a moment they seemed to take up most of her face. Silver gray, those eyes, the color of old hull plating under station light. She had white hair, very fine, the kind of hair that moves in the airflow from a vent, and it moved now as the pod's circulation fans kicked up a notch in response to the locker being opened. Her skin was amber, a warm, muted amber, the color of certain kinds of processed ore pressed into bar stock, and along her temples and collarbones, I could see faint ridges that glimmered, very slightly in the low light. Not glowing, more like the surface of something that would glow if it were warmer. She was small, waist-high would have been generous. She had pointed ears, fine-tipped, and she was wearing a garment I could only describe as a ship's child smock. The kind of thing you outfit a young one in when they're aboard a working vessel, plain gray fabric, slightly too large, belted with a cord. She was not crying. She was not screaming. She was watching me with the exact expression of a person who has decided to wait and see what the larger, louder creature in the room is going to do next, I said, in compact standard. How did you get on my ship? She did not answer. The Veth, and I knew she was Veth from the skin and the ridges and the ears. I had been running along the edge of the corridor for years, and I knew the species on site. The Veth do not typically speak compact standard, particularly not the young ones. They have their own language, which I do not speak and have never learned, a dense phonemic system that sounds to an untrained ear like running water over stone. She did not make that sound either. She simply looked at me. I said, in what I intended as a neutral tone, "All right." Then I went back to the cockpit and sat down and thought about my numbers again. The math was straightforward and it was not good. A Type 7 rated for one occupant has life support calculated for one occupant's respiratory output, one occupant's heat signature, one occupant's water consumption, a second body, even a small one, even a child, changes every number. It doubles the CO2 scrubber load. It changes the heat retention curve. It changes the food and water timeline. I was not worried about food and water. I had restocked the locker at the last platform stop, which is something I always do, and there was enough for 2 people for 2 days even if the rescue window extended. I was not worried about air. The scrubbers were good, and the pod volume gave us margin. I was worried about heat. Here is the thing about the Type 7 that the certification documents do not adequately convey. It is designed to maintain internal temperature above the human survival threshold for 48 hours. It does this with a resistive heating grid embedded in the floor and walls, powered off the main cells, backed up by a secondary thermal battery. At rated occupancy, 1 person, the system has a comfortable margin. It is designed with the understanding that a person in an emergency is moving around, generating body heat, consuming power through activity. It assumes a certain metabolic contribution from the occupant. What the certification documents also do not adequately convey is what happens when your pod drifts into a debris field at the edge of a contested zone and a chunk of processed ore slag maybe 20 centimeters across. impacts the port hull at a relative velocity of about 800 meters per second, and does not breach the hull. Does not, because a Type 7's hull is designed to absorb exactly this kind of micro-impact, but does crack the secondary thermal battery housing and reduce the thermal backup system's capacity by roughly 60%. I discovered this approximately 4 minutes after I went back to the cockpit. The secondary battery alarm was quiet, a soft amber pulse on the panel, the kind of alarm designed not to panic you. And I stared at it for a moment before I understood what I was looking at. Then I ran the math again, and the math was considerably worse than it had been before. At rated occupancy, with a fully functional secondary battery, I had 48 hours of thermal maintenance. With the battery at 40% capacity and a second occupant, I ran it twice to be sure, somewhere between 28 and 32 hours before the interior temperature dropped below the human survival threshold. The VETH threshold, I did not know precisely, but I knew enough of their physiology to know it was not dramatically different from my own. They were not cold adapted, not the kind of species that thrives in low temperature, and a child's mass was small enough that she would reach her limit faster than I would. I sat with this for about 2 minutes. Then I went back to the locker. She had not moved. She was still in the lower shelf, still watching me, still holding the 2 emergency blankets partway over herself. I crouched down in front of her, which put my eye level roughly at hers, and I did a careful visual assessment. She was thin the way children who haven't eaten enough are thin, not in the way children who are injured are thin. Her breathing was even. Her ridges were dim, which I read as cold stress, and her fingers were pressed together inside the blankets, which confirmed it. She was chilled but not in crisis. She would be in crisis in a few hours if I did not do something about it. I reached past her and pulled the second emergency blanket out and wrapped it around the first one, doubling the layer over her shoulders. She let me do this without moving, only tracked me with those silver-gray eyes as my hands worked. Then I reached into my suit's chest pocket and found what I was looking for. A cargo seal token, standard compact issue, about 4 centimeters across, made of synthetic ivory composite, rounded at the edges, with the drift's manifest code etched into one face, and a simple loop on the other for attaching to a cargo line. I had carried one in my chest pocket for years. Not for any operational reason. Just the habit of having something in my hand when I was thinking. I held it out to her on my palm. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at me. Then she took it very carefully with both hands, the way you take something you've decided you're allowed to have, and closed her fingers around it. I said, "Good. Now hold on to that." I did not know if she understood the words. I think she understood something, though. The tone, or the gesture, or simply the fact that I had given her something, rather than taken something, and that this was information about what kind of thing I was. She held the token. I went back to the cockpit and started working the problem. What I had: one intact heating grid, powered off the main cells, functional but drawing at a rate that ate into my reserve power faster than I liked. One secondary thermal battery at 40% capacity, 2 emergency blankets, now both on the child, my own cold weather outer layer, a heavy-duty insulated jacket I had pulled on in the 40 seconds before I left the drift. Because pulling on your outer layer before you run for a pod is the first thing they teach you and the first thing people get when the adrenaline hits, and I had not forgotten. One standard issue emergency sleeping bag, rated to -20, stored in the back of the locker behind the medkit kit. Several meters of mylar thermal sheeting, the kind used to wrap sensitive cargo against temperature fluctuation, stored in a flat roll in the locker floor, and the pod itself, its geometry, its airflow, its power routing, its bulkhead arrangement. I spent the first 2 hours on insulation. The mylar sheeting was the key. I stripped it out in sections and layered it against the interior walls of the pod's main compartment, using adhesive strips from the repair kit to hold it in place, working from the floor up to the ceiling, on every surface I could reach without dismantling anything structural. Mylar is a radiant barrier. It does not generate heat. It reflects heat back into the compartment, rather than letting it bleed through the hull. It is what you wrap a cold body in when you have nothing else. And it is what you line a cold room with when the room is too small to heat efficiently. I had maybe 30 square meters of it, and I used all of it, overlapping the seams by 10 centimeters to close the thermal bridges. While I was doing this, she watched me from the locker. After a while, she moved, came out of the locker shelf in a careful sideways shuffle, feet finding the floor, the blanket still around her shoulders, and sat against the aft bulkhead with her back to the wall and her knees pulled, and the cargo token in one hand. She did not get in my way. She tracked every movement I made with those pale eyes, and occasionally, when I moved past her, she would shift slightly to keep me in view, but she never reached out and never spoke and never made a sound I could characterize as distress. What she made was a sound I can only describe as presence, the sounds of a small body breathing, slight movement on the floor, of fingers turning a cargo token over and over in the quiet. I talked to her while I worked. I do not know why I started. I am not a man who talks to himself. I am comfortable with silence, always have been, and on long hauls I will sometimes go 12 hours without speaking a word, just running the route and listening to the ship. With her there, it felt wrong to be silent, and so I talked. I explained what I was doing and why. I told her about thermal barriers and radiant reflection, and the relationship between surface area and heat loss. I told her that the pod had been built by a company called Aris Modular Systems on a platform called Terrath Station about 9 years ago, and that Aris Modular Systems made good pods, solid pods, and that I had personally inspected this one at the start of the run and found it within spec on every point I could test. I told her that the beacon was transmitting and that the Compact's corridor patrol would find us, and that they would find us while we were still warm, because I was going to make sure of it. I do not know how much of this she understood. She did not indicate comprehension in any way I could verify. But she kept watching me, and at some point she unwrapped one of the blankets from her shoulders and held it out to me. Just held it out, extended in her small amber hand, and I looked at it for a moment and then I said, "No, you keep that. I have the jacket." She held it out a moment longer. Then she pulled it back around herself and went back to turning the token in her fingers. That was the moment I understood what kind of child she was. Not helpless. She had worked out, in whatever language her mind used for working things out, that the blanket was a resource, and that I was cold, and that the correct thing to do was share it. She was wrong about my needing it. I was cold, but my jacket was holding, but she was not wrong about the logic, and she had offered, prompted wordlessly, with the flat matter-of-fact generosity of someone who had decided that the right thing to do was obvious and did not require any particular ceremony. I went back to the miler and kept working. By the 6th hour, I had the main compartment as well insulated as I could make it. Without tools I didn't have. The temperature had stabilized, not risen, stopped dropping, and the heating grid was drawing at a rate I could sustain through the remainder of the main cell charge. I had bought us time. I recalculated, if the beacon held, if the cell discharge stayed on the lower end of my estimate, if the external temperature of the debris field didn't drop further. All three of those were conditional. The first one was the one I trusted least, because the electromagnetic interference in the field was intermittent, and I had no way of knowing whether the beacon was getting through consistently. I had somewhere between 26 and 30 hours. Troll sweep timing I had memorized at the last platform briefing. Put the next corridor sweep at approximately 14 hours from the time of the incident. That meant I had a margin. Not a comfortable margin, but a margin. I sat down on the floor next to the locker and ate a ration pack. I opened a second one and put it in front of her. She looked at it and looked at me, and then picked it up, and with some effort, peeled the seal tab the way she had seen me do it and ate. She ate slowly and methodically. She ate everything in it. She did not appear to enjoy it in any expressive sense, but she cleaned it out thoroughly, which told me she was hungry enough to eat compressed nutrient paste that would challenge the appetite of a species used to it. I made a note to watch her hydration and set a timer to offer her water in 2 hours. Around the 8th hour, the beacon flickered. I know this because I was watching the panel. I had been watching the panel with the constant low-grade attention of someone who has decided that the panel is the most important thing in the room, and the beacon status light went from steady green to amber to green again in the space of about 3 seconds. Interference from the debris field. I had expected it. I reconfigured the beacon's pulse pattern to a long interval burst mode, which uses more power per burst, but drives the signal further and with more penetration through interference. It was the correct choice. It shortened my power reserve by a small but non-trivial amount. A beacon that gets through, intermittently, is worth more than one that transmits steadily, but never clears the noise floor. Outer loop navigation teaches you this. You learn to think about signals the way you think about everything else out there, not in terms of what the equipment is rated for, but in terms of what will actually work in the conditions you're actually in. She had fallen asleep by then. Not fully asleep. She was in the state I have seen children in, when they are too cold and too tired to maintain free wakefulness but too alert to fully surrender to sleep. A kind of suspended drowse where the body has made a practical decision and the mind hasn't entirely agreed to it yet. She was propped against the aft bulkhead, the blankets around her, the token still in her hand, and her head had tipped forward. So her chin was on her chest and her fine white hair had fallen across her face. She was breathing in the slow, even rhythm of sleep, but her fingers were still closed on the token. I turned the heating grid down 3%. Not enough to feel dangerous, but enough to extend the cell charge by another hour and a half. Then I settled in to wait. Waiting in a cold small space is its own kind of work. I do not mean that in a poetic sense. I mean it practically. Your body wants to move, wants to generate heat through motion. And the correct response is to suppress that impulse. Because motion costs energy and energy is in limited supply, and what you need your body to do is exactly what it is least inclined to do, which is to hold still and be efficient. I sat with my back against the pilot's seat, and my arms crossed and my breathing slow and managed, and I cataloged the pod's sounds, circulation fans, the heating grid's low hum, the occasional micro-impact of debris against the hull, small stuff, sand-sized, clicking against the composite like a faint, scattered rain, the sound of her breathing. I had not intended to listen to her breathing as a specific thing, but in the quiet of the pod, with nothing else demanding active attention, it became the most important sound in the room. It was small and even and alive, and in a space that had several ways of becoming very quiet very quickly. The sound of something alive and breathing was information I found I wanted. Round the 10th hour, she shifted in her sleep and made a sound, not language, not distress, something between the two, the small involuntary vocalization of a cold body adjusting. And without fully deciding to, I moved over beside her and sat there, close enough that my jacket was against the blankets around her shoulder. Not holding her, just adjacent. Body heat works by proximity. This is physics, not sentiment. She settled back into the deeper breathing of sleep, and I sat there with my back against the aft bulkhead and watched the panel from a distance and kept the count. I am going to be honest with you about what happened over the next several hours, because the account I gave the Compact's incident review was accurate, but incomplete, and I think the incomplete parts are the ones that matter. What happened is that I ran out of useful things to do. I had insulated the compartment, I had optimized the beacon, I had rationed the power, I had managed the heating grid. I had inventoried every resource in the pod and calculated every contingency I could calculate, and by the 12th hour I had done everything that could be done, and was now simply waiting for the math to resolve in one direction or another. And the thing about waiting when you have done everything that can be done is that you are left with nothing between you and the truth of the situation, which is that you do not know if it will be enough. I am not a man who manages uncertainty with equanimity. I manage it with work. I find something to fix or optimize or plan, and I stay in that mode until the uncertainty is resolved, or I run out of things to work on. Running out of things to work on is the state I find most difficult. In 23 years of outer loop running, I had been in a handful of situations that felt genuinely dangerous, and in every one of them, there had been something to do. Even if the thing was small, even if it only bought minutes, there had been a next action. This was the first time I had arrived at a state where I had made every move available to me, and the game was still in progress. I sat there in the cold and the quiet, and the sound of her breathing, and I thought about the beacon interval, and the patrol schedule, and the thermal battery discharge curve. And none of these thoughts were new thoughts. because I had already thought them all. And so they cycled. After a while, I stopped cycling them. After a while, I just sat. She woke up around the 14th hour. Came up from sleep cleanly, the way some people do. No confusion, no gradual surfacing, just a shift from eyes closed to eyes open and present. The silver-gray irises, orient immediately, found me, held. She sat up straighter and looked around the pod's interior, and looked at the panel, and back at me. She still had the token in her hand. Her ridges were warmer than they had been. A faint amber light in them now, just at the edges, which I took as a good sign about her core temperature. She looked at me for a long time. Then she did something I did not expect. The token down between us, in the middle of the floor, equidistant from both of us, and she put her hand next to it. Not on it, just next to it, and looked at me. I looked at the token. I looked at her hand next to it. Then I put my hand next to it on the other side, mirroring her exactly. And we sat like that for a moment, with the token between us and our hands on either side of it, like a small treaty signing, and she made a sound then, low, complex, 3 or 4 tones braided together, that I could not parse and cannot reproduce, but that I understood, in the way you sometimes understand something without having the mechanism for it, to be a statement of some kind. A declaration. She was declaring something, I said. Agreed, because it seemed like the right response. She looked at me steadily for another moment, and then picked the token back up and held it again. We shared another ration pack. I gave her my water first and drank after. She watched me do the prioritization and did not object, told me something about where she had been and what she had learned about adults before she ended up in my cargo locker. I did not like what it told me, but I filed it. The 16th hour, the 17th. I turned the heating grid down another 2% and bought another 40 minutes of charge. The beacon was transmitting on the burst interval, and I had no way of knowing if it was clearing the interference. I ran through the power calculation one more time and found I had less margin than I had hoped. The secondary battery had degraded further, crack in the housing allowing a slow thermal drain I had not fully accounted for in the first calculation. I revised the thermal maintenance window down to 26 hours from the time of impact, which meant I had approximately 9 hours remaining at the current rate of heat loss. I did not tell her this. I do not know why I did not tell her. She wouldn't have understood the numbers, and I am not sure I was making a conscious decision about disclosure. I simply sat with the number and kept my face the way I keep my face when I am working a calculation and have arrived at an answer I do not like and deciding what to do about it. What I did was take off my jacket. Not because I was warm, I was not warm, I was managing, which is a different thing. I took it off because my jacket was the last insulating layer I had not deployed, and I wrapped it around her over the blankets, and the arrangement was immediately uncomfortable for me and immediately better for her. She looked at me when I did it and made a sound I read as protest, and I said, "I've got the seat. The seat's warmer than the floor." This was marginally true. The pilot's seat had a thin layer of foam padding that would give me some insulation from the floor. And I moved to the pilot's seat and sat in it and was colder than before, and calculated that this had bought her approximately 2 hours of additional thermal protection and me approximately 40 minutes of additional cold exposure, and that the trade was correct. The 19th hour was the one I liked least. Not because anything changed. Nothing changed, and that was the problem. In an outer loop emergency, there is almost always a deteriorating variable. Something getting worse at a measurable rate, giving you a target, giving you a problem to solve. The 19th hour gave me nothing of that kind. The temperature held at 11 degrees. Power curve was steady on its decline. The beacon was transmitting. I had done everything there was to do, and the situation was holding at a level of bad that was not yet critical, and the only thing between the current state and the critical state was time, and I had no instrument for managing time except to sit inside it and keep track. I ran through the outer loop protocol for extended cold exposure, which I had not thought about in years, but which surfaced cleanly from wherever the brain stores things drilled into it under pressure. Keep the core warm. Keep the extremities moving enough to maintain circulation. Eat if you have food. Drink before you think you need to. Keep the mind occupied, because a mind that stops working is a body that follows. I ate half a ration pack, Only half. Because I was counting them now, and drank my water allocation, and flexed my fingers and thought, in a deliberate, structured way, about the route I would file when I reached the next platform. I'd been considering a new approach vector to the Meson relay chain that would cut transit time by about 3 hours on the long haul. I worked through the calculation in detail, counting for the current drift correction required at the midpoint and the platform's approach queue timing, and the calculation kept me occupied for approximately 45 minutes, at the end of which I had an answer I was reasonably confident in, and which was entirely useless to me in the current situation, and which I found, nevertheless, satisfying in the specific way that a solved problem is satisfying regardless of its practical application. She watched me through all of this. I could feel her attention the way you feel a particular kind of quiet. Not the absence of something, but the presence of it. She was not asleep. She was sitting with her back to the aft bulkhead, and her knees pulled up and the blankets and jacket arranged around herself with the systematic precision of someone who has understood that the arrangement is functional and not decorative, and she was turning the cargo token in her fingers with the patience of a person who has decided that the situation calls for patience and has applied it without drama. I have been in the company of adults in emergency situations who managed themselves worse. I have been in the company of adults who managed themselves considerably worse and who were, by every external measure, experienced outer loop operators. She was perhaps 4 years old by any reckoning I could apply, and she sat in the cold with the even patience of stone. Around the 20th hour she did something I did not expect and have thought about many times since. She held the cargo token up in front of her face, held it close, examining the etched face. And then she held it up so I could see it from where I sat. She pointed to the manifest code with one small finger and looked at me, asking, "What does this say?" I told her. I told her the drift's manifest code and what manifest codes meant and how the compact's cargo registration system worked, moving from the specific code on the token to the general system of how freight moved between the platforms and the relay stations and the processing nodes. I talked for about 20 minutes. She listened with the focused attention she gave everything, and at the end of it, she looked at the token for a long moment, and then put it back against her chest, holding it there with one hand, and nodded. The nod was unmistakable, a single clean downward tilt of her chin, the gesture with no ambiguity in it. She had been given information and had filed it. I sat with the slight absurdity of having just explained interstellar cargo registration to a Veth child in a damaged escape pod in a debris field, and found that I had no particular objection to it. It had passed 20 minutes. I believe I slept for a while after that. Not intentionally, sleep was not on the plan, and I would have said, if asked, that I was too cold and too alert to sleep. But the body has its own plans, and there is a state of cold and stillness and exhaustion where the body simply cashes in whatever credit it has and takes what it needs. I do not know how long. I came back to awareness with my chin on my chest and the panel's amber pulse in front of me and a weight against my right side. She had moved from the aft bulkhead to the pilot's seat area. She was wedged between my right side and the seat's armrest inside my jacket, which she had apparently brought with her, and rearranged around both of us, still holding the token in one hand and with her other hand, inside the jacket's front panel against my side. She was radiating her own heat, small as it was, conducting through the fabric into my ribs, and she was asleep or near it, with her face pressed into the side of my arm. Shh. I sat with that for a moment. Then I made a careful adjustment so that my arm could come down around the outside of the jacket, put my hand at her back, and I held her in the approximation of the way a person holds a sleeping child, which is not something I have a great deal of practice at. The panel showed the same steady amber. The beacon interval was holding. My power calculation had slipped. More degradation on the battery, and I revised the window again, and the number was not good, and I held the small warm weight against my side and looked at the amber light and thought, not yet, not for a while yet. I talked to her while she slept. I talked about the outer loops, about the routes I had run, about the smell of a platform's air recyclers first thing in the morning cycle, and the sound a freighter makes when it's fully loaded and you power it up from cold. I talked about a port called Messon 7 at the edge of the old compact boundary line, where the processing platforms were built on a gas extraction field, and the lights of them, seen from the approach vector, like a city floating in space, which is almost what they were. I talked about bad runs and good runs, and the particular satisfaction of a manifest that reconciled to the decimal on the first pass. I talked quietly into the cold air of the pod, and she slept. I will tell you when the beacon cleared the interference, because I was watching the panel when it happened. The 21st hour, the status light went from its amber burst cycle to a sustained deep green, which meant the signal had made it out of the local noise floor and was transmitting clean. I did not know how long it had been transmitting clean. The panel only showed currents status, but the debris field had at a regular electromagnetic cycle driven by the larger fragment's rotation. And I knew from the cycle timing that we were in a clear window of approximately 3 to 4 hours. Enough. If there was a patrol sweep anywhere in the area, they would hear us in that window. I powered the beacon up to full continuous transmission and accepted the power cost. The temperature had dropped to 11 degrees Celsius in the main compartment by then. It was cold enough to be uncomfortable, cold enough that my fingers were moving slowly, and my thinking had the slightly padded quality that cold brings. Every conclusion takes a half second to arrive, and you have to push through a layer of resistance to form the next action. I was aware of this and was managing it, applying the specific mental discipline I had learned in years of working in cold environments, keeping the simple, keeping the decision sequential, not trying to hold too much at once, one thing, then the next thing. Don't reach past the next step. She woke up around the 23rd hour, fully, cleanly, the same way she had woken before. She looked at the panel with what I can only describe as professional attention. She had been watching that panel for hours. She knew what its normal state looked like. And she saw the beacon light, deep green, continuous. And she looked at it for a moment, and then she made a sound. Not the complex braided declaration from before. Something shorter, quieter. It was the sound, I thought, of someone who has been waiting a long time and has arrived at the moment of either resolution or failure, and is registering very quietly that the situation has changed, I said. Green means it's working. She held the token against her collarbone. The ridges there were lit more strongly than I had yet seen them. A warm amber glow, distinct now, real luminescence that Veth use for what I had been told are emotional signals. Though I could not read the signal, only register its presence. She turned the token over once in her fingers and then offered it to me, held out in the flat of her palm. I looked at it. Then I shook my head. You hold it, I said. I'll get it back when we're somewhere warm. She closed her fingers on it again. The 26th hour, 28. The temperature was 9 degrees, and I was beyond managing it. I was simply in it. The cold, a fact of my body the way fatigue is a fact of the body after too long without sleep. Something that you stop fighting and start incorporating. She was pressed against my side, and she was warm under the jacket and blankets. And I was less warm, and the math was running out in a direction I had known it might run out in since the 16th hour. I had done everything I could. I want to be clear about that, not because I want credit for it, but because the clarity of it is what I held on to in those final hours. There was no further action available. I had played every card in the deck. Now I was sitting in the results. I did not lose consciousness in any dramatic sense. I did not slump forward or fall over. What happened was more gradual, a progressive narrowing, the way narrows at the edges when you're coming down from a hard exertion, the world contracting to the things closest to you, and the thinking slowing to match. What I was closest to was the panel, green and steady, and what I was closest to was her against my side, warm and real, and breathing in the slow rhythm of a child who has decided that the thing holding is safe enough to sleep against. I thought about the pod's temperature. I thought about the beacon. I thought about the patrol sweep timing. Thought about nothing useful. I thought for a while about the cargo token in her hand, about the etched manifest code on its face, and the attachment loop on the other side, and the way it had sat in my chest pocket for 3 years before, today, and was now in the hand of a Veth child, in an escape pod, in a debris field at the edge of the corridor. There is something in that, I thought. without being entirely sure what the something was. A token made for attaching cargo to a cargo line, now in the hand of a child, now the thing she had held onto for 28 hours. The thing she would not put down. I was not attached to it, I realized. And I had thought of it as mine, but I was not attached to it. And if she wanted it, she could have it. I would tell her so when we were warm. I have no precise memory of the cutter's arrival. I know what happened from the incident review, from the cutter's crew log, from the medic's account, from what I have been able to reconstruct from those sources. What I know is that the patrol cutter Veth Corridor Sweep 4 Delta, call sign Ardith, picked up our beacon at hour 27, and was on intercept within 40 minutes, and had us aboard by hour 29. I know that when they opened the pod, they found the main compartment insulated with cargo mylar on every surface, the temperature at 7 degrees Celsius, the power cells at 11%. I know that they found me in the pilot's seat, with my arms around a Veth child, and my core temperature at 32.1 degrees, is a number the medic described as close in a tone that meant something more than close. I know that she was warmer than I was, and that she was still holding the cargo token, and that when the cutter's crew tried to separate us to get me onto the medical platform, she made a sound, the braided complex sound, the declaration sound, and would not be moved until I was moved first, so that she was brought to the cutter's medical bay immediately after me, and placed in the bay across from mine. I was revived over the course of about 2 hours. Warming protocols, fluid replacement, the standard procedure the Compact's medical certification requires for cold exposure cases. I was conscious by the time they had me at 35 degrees, and the medic, a young woman, Compact service, very efficient, told me that my temperature had been low enough that another hour in the pod would have been a serious problem, and that the insulation I had done on the compartment had bought us more time than the pod's systems could have managed on their own, and that the child was in good condition, better than me. Which she delivered with the flat factual tone of someone reporting a maintenance finding, rather than a compliment, but which I understood to be both. I lay on the medical platform and watched the ceiling and felt the warmth coming back into my hands. After a while, I looked across the bay. She was in the opposite berth, wrapped in a thermal blanket, with a Compact medic's monitoring clip on her wrist, and she was looking at me. The silver-gray eyes, steady and pale. The ridgelines on her temples and collarbones were lit. The warm amber bioluminescence clear and even, not the cold dim I had seen in the pod, and not the reactive flare I had seen when she heard the beacon go green, but something steadier, something held. She had the cargo token in her hand. When she saw that I was looking at her, she made a sound, not the declaration sound, protest sound, something smaller, shorter, with a rising pitch at the end, and held the token up briefly, showing it to me, back against her chest. I said, I know, I see it. The efficient young medic, who was standing at the side of the bay making notations on a pad, said without looking up, Is she yours? I turned the question over in my mind the way I turn a cargo manifest over, looking for the error, checking the columns. She was not something I knew. She had come out of my cargo locker on a freighter that was now debris. She'd been in that cargo locker for reasons I did not know, in a garment that suggested she had been aboard a working vessel before mine, and her species presence in the corridor was not something the Compact had extensive documentation on. She was not mine in the sense that possession is mine. She was not mine in the sense that legal guardianship is mine. She was, as far as any documentation in existence could establish, an unclassified minor of Veth species with no registered origin, no manifest entry, no formal status. I lay on the medical platform and thought about the cargo token in her hand and the sound she had made when the beacon went green, and the way she had held the blanket out to me at the 8th hour matter-of-factly, because sharing it was the right thing, and she had decided that without ceremony. I thought about 29 hours in a pod at 7 degrees, with her pressed against my side, and her fingers closed on a piece of stamped composite that wasn't worth anything, and was now the thing she had held, all of it. The efficient young medic waited for my answer. I said mine, until someone proves otherwise. She made a notation. I did not look at what she wrote. I looked across the bay at the silver-gray eyes and the warm amber glow of the ridge lines and the small hand closed on the cargo token. And she was looking back at me with the steady particular patience of someone who has decided to wait and see, who has decided that waiting and seeing is a position she can hold indefinitely, and who has, perhaps, begun to have a view about what she is waiting to see. I have been asked since to describe what it felt like. I am not well equipped to describe what things feel like. I am a man who describes what things are and what they do, not what they feel like, but I will try, because I think it is the part of the account that the incident review left out, and that the incident review was wrong to leave out. What it felt like was resolved. The same way a manifest feels when it reconciles, same way a route feels when you have run it enough times that the corrections are automatic and the variables have become known quantities. Not finished. Nothing about the situation was finished. There was a great deal ahead that was entirely uncharted. A species I did not speak, and a bureaucracy I would have to learn, and a small person whose history I did not know and whose future was, at that moment, in no way secured, but resolved in the sense that the question I had not known I was answering had been answered, and the answer was irreversible, and the irreversibility of it was something I had no particular problem with. She was mine until someone proved otherwise. She was mine in the sense that a cargo that has been loaded and sealed and signed for is yours. It is in your care. The care is the obligation, and the obligation does not end because the run gets difficult. I had accepted her into my care in the 29th hour of that pod, or the 21st, or the 14th, or the 8th, or the moment I opened the locker panel, and she looked up at me with those silver-gray eyes and did not ask me for anything, and did not make any sound I could characterize as demand, and simply waited to see what I was going to do. I am not sure when I accepted it. I am sure that, by the time I was lying on that medical platform, it was already a fact about the world, and I was simply recognizing it. There is an addendum I want to give you, because the account above ends at a point that feels complete, but is not in fact how the matter resolved. The compact took some time with her status. They are not an institution that moves quickly when the situation is novel, and a Veth child of indeterminate origin in the care of a compact registered freighter captain who had just lost his vessel in an incident the review, still characterizing, was from the compact's perspective, several categories of novel at once. There were forms and then more forms, and then a consultation with the compact's Border Species Relations Office, and then a determination that the Veth do not recognize the compact's unilateral guardianship declarations, which meant that the declaration I had made on the medical platform was formally valid within compact jurisdiction and formally meaningless within Veth jurisdiction, which covered approximately half the space I intended to operate in. I spent 4 months on that problem. I will spare you the detail. What I will tell you is that the Veth Corridor Liaison Office, when I finally got a human representative in the same room with a Veth cultural mediator and a compact records officer and a photograph of a child, silver-gray eyes, and a cargo token in her hand, was not as obstructive as I had feared. What the Veth cultural mediator told me, through the translator, is a piece of information I have turned over many times since. He said that the bioluminescence of the ridgelines, the warm amber glow I had seen on her at specific moments in the pod, is not a pure emotional signal in the way I had been told. It is more precise than that. It is a kin signal. It activates in the presence of a person the Veth individual has assessed as safe and binding. Cultural mediator used a word I cannot reproduce in standard, but the translator gave it as something close to chosen anchor, family in the genetic sense, family in the assessed sense, a person the Veth child has evaluated by some mechanism I am not qualified to describe as the person they are anchored to. I thought about the 14th hour, token between us on the floor, her hand next to it, and then mine, the sound she made. I thought about the 23rd hour, beacon going green, the token held against her collarbone and the glow. The cultural mediator said, through the translator, kin signal given by a Veth child is not revocable. It is assessment. It is a conclusion. It carries within Veth law a weight that the compact's guardianship declaration had been trying to approximate and had not quite reached. The compact records officer, to her credit, wrote it down. There was more paperwork after that. There is always more paperwork. But the paperwork resolved eventually, the way all paperwork resolves when the underlying facts are not in dispute, and the parties are patient enough. And I will not bore you with the process. I will tell you only the outcome, which is this. Her name, as near as I can render it in standard, is Serev. This is not her Veth name, which I cannot say correctly and am still learning. But it is the name she indicated acceptance of. When I offered it, by holding the cargo token against her chest and making the short rising sound. The same sound she made on the medical platform, the one with the rising pitch at the end, the one I have come to understand as affirmative. I offered several sounds over several evenings, and that one she chose. She is 8 years old now, by the compact's age reckoning, which is close enough to hers for administrative purposes. She is learning standard at a pace that makes me feel acutely aware of how slowly I am learning her language in return, which she finds, I think, amusing in the quiet way she finds most things amusing. A still, attentive, slightly elevated quality of watchfulness that I have come to recognize as her version of what other people express with sound. She has the cargo token on a cord around her neck, which was her idea, accomplished by the careful threading of a piece of wire through the attachment loop. I have not asked for it back. I will not. I am running cargo again, on a new vessel I will not name in this account. She knows the route. She knows the manifest protocol, and the beacon interval, and the thermal battery check, and the way to read the debris field, weather at the edge of the corridor. She is a better student than I was, and she is not patient about error in the way I was patient about error, which is to say she is not patient about error at all. We run the outer loop together now. The cold is the same as it ever was, deep and patient and indifferent. It has always been indifferent. It was indifferent to me for 23 years before I had a reason to work harder against it than I had ever worked before, and it will be indifferent long after both of us are done. But we are still warm, and the beacon is transmitting, and the math, for now, resolves in our favor. That is how I kept the promise. She never said please. She never said anything at all, in any language I had, and I kept it anyway, because it was the only correct action, and because she had told me so, in the only language she had, with a cargo token on the floor between us and her hand next to mine, and a sound I still cannot reproduce, but have never since forgotten.